Hello. Did you ever wonder why Minnesota? I'm talking to you from the announcement of a drawdown. I don't know why they use militaristic terms, but the drawdown from Minneapolis and what we have witnessed, the brutal, brutal ICE campaign of terror and threatening and intimidation on the city of Minneapolis. And we also saw the incredible resistance in Minneapolis at the same time. And you might be like me and say, well, what? Minneapolis. Like the first thing I think when I think Minneapolis, I think Prince and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. I know that's terrible. That's terrible. But that's what I think of. And so unless you live in Minneapolis and have a richer understanding of Minneapolis, you say, well, why Minneapolis? Did you see this groundswell of collective resistance? Why didn't it happen when ICE were deployed to DC or Los Angeles or Chicago, cities with a history of strong activist roots? And we think of Minneapolis as being kind of, everyday, how you doing type of thing. Why was it Minneapolis? That's what I want to answer or try to address today from a Black feminist geographies perspective and define the term abolitionist geographies. Abolition geographies. But before I get there, you're here with me so far. Let me introduce myself. If you are new here, I am Dr. Keisha Anna Mashawn Ducree. I'm a Black Studies professor. I am a Black feminist geographer, your friendly neighborhood Black feminist geographer, and the creator of the SoulJourners Academy, which offers transformative learning experiences for families looking for a decolonized look at the world, particularly the Black diaspora. So SoulJourners Academy produces online workshops for grown-ups. We produce kid travel guides for kids in specific places where there is a African descendant population in popular tourist areas. And our signature is delivering cultural immersion trips for families on sites in the Black diaspora. So in 2025, we did a Costa Rica trip, the Caribbean part of Costa Rica. And in 2026, we are offering Black family or family study abroad in looking at Black New Orleans, Black heritage in New Orleans. We are going to be going to the area of Loíza in Puerto Rico. We're sponsoring a Panama Canal cruise to visit ports that have a history of Black, of African descended folks. And we're also working on another international trip. If these things are interested to you, you can look in the links. You can follow me on SoulJourners on Facebook and sign up on a list to get information and get on waiting lists for all this. But the shameless self-plug, I can't help but get it off the top of my head. But what I really want to say, if you're new here, and you like what you've heard so far, please like this video, please subscribe, share this across other people. When you guys probably got together and were like, Minneapolis, if you were like me and said, I know that Minneapolis has a sound, I know that's Morris in the Time, Prince, Jimmy Jam, Terry Lewis. If you had a thin idea of Minneapolis and are interested in looking at Minneapolis from a Black geographic perspective, share that with them. I would love to increase my subscribers. Right now I'm at 80. I'm proud of my 80. I worked hard for my 80, but I like to get to 100. Let's get this to 100. I want to get this message out, and I want this to be kind of the first stop of a critical learning space in looking at what's happening in today's world and talking about sites of Black resistance along the diaspora. Okay, so let's take this moment right now before I charge on and like and subscribe. There you go. Thank you. Thank you. And share. You know, you just go down, share, hit copy, and send it to somebody. Yeah, you did that? Thank you. Great. Great. Thank you so much. So I think that I can answer the question on geographic. Like it's for me, it's like Minneapolis. But what about DC? Like, how did this happen? This resistance movement that we saw. And I was driving, I'm an NPR addict, National Public Radio, I'm an addict. When I'm in a car, I'm listening to it. When I'm putting around in the kitchen in the morning, I'm listening to it. One of my sons, when he was little, he was like, why do we have to listen to this talking? And I was like, this is an education, be quiet. So one day, maybe last week, probably about last week, I was listening and I caught, because I'm driving, so I turn it on. So I'm in the middle of a conversation. And it looks like the Minnesota Public Radio station did a town hall in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I didn't know all this at the time. When I turned on the radio, it was a woman talking, and she was saying, this has been done before. The groundwork has been laid. The groundwork has been laid, she said, especially among queer Black women activists. And I was like, yes, there's something in this. And then I had to go. So I had to figure out, what was this program and who was she and what was the longer conversation? I have the link in the description to the YouTube video that was recorded at the time of this Minnesota Public Radio town hall. And the person that I want you to pay particular attention to is Tish Jones. She announces herself as Tish Jones, and she's a poet. And she comes in about the 16-minute mark. But when you have time to watch the whole thing, I encourage you to do so, because what you'll find in that town hall is reminiscent of the people, I think, versus what media accounts show you in terms of the people that are the key resistors on the street. One thing to note in Minnesota town hall is that most of the speakers, I think they might have about 6 or 7, and it's being moderated by NPR host. Most of the speakers were Black women. The first 2 or 3 were Black women, and then there were more Black women. And that's not necessarily what you would have assumed if you're looking at video of the protests. You see largely white groups, and we know of the tragic deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, that they were white. And so this was a really interesting look at a town hall where you do see Black women speaking. And when Tish Jones said that they laid the groundwork during or immediately following the George Floyd assassination, I was like, that's it. I knew it, but I didn't know it. Like, I thought it, but I didn't have proof. But that is why Minneapolis when ICE were deployed made a difference, because Minneapolis has been at this point before. They have been at this point before with not only the death of George Floyd, but Philando Castile in 2016 and a number of others. And at the forefront of those movements, those Black Lives Matter protests against police and state violence were reactivated for the anti-ICE protests that you see. That was what was missing. And that is the truth. And that's not what you would have known if it hadn't been for this context. And it makes sense, right? The way it's presented to us in kind of popular media is that, it by popular media, it's just people who were home and they just came out. And while that is true for some, I mean, the sides of it shows that there were people who were moved, and everyone seen the guy who's like cursing and was like, I don't do this. There were, they always interviewed the people who was like, I don't usually protest. Well, it took the people that usually protest to pull together something to get everybody off of their couch, including the people who were compelled to come out and bear witness that don't protest. This was not a just a bringing up of protests. This is to see what happens here. It is embedded within the time and spatial context of the George Floyd protest and Black Lives Matter protest of 2020. Now, Tish Jones, I call her by both names. If anybody knows Tish Jones, please let her know that her 3 lines that I heard on the way going to campus was what spurred me to do this, because I knew that there was something, but I had no proof, and I'm really proud. I'm really excited that I found out. But she goes on to say, to understand what's happening now, you have to understand the work that was done during the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020. And that she used the term power mapping. And every time I hear the word map, my ears perk up. I was like, mapping? Did somebody say mapping? So she called it power mapping, that Black women activists power mapped after that. And what that means, I got to get my little notes together. A power map means that they were harnessing the power, a collective community power, and you can see it spatially, and they operated spatially. So let's break down the power mapping for a minute. The mapping part. It's important to note particular sites in the anti-ICE protests in Minneapolis. While ICE was deployed many spaces, there was a concentration in the area around where George Floyd lived and where George Floyd died. That area was besieged by ICE. They were everywhere. I mean, there were ultimately 3,000 ICE thugs deployed in Minneapolis, when in a city that only has 600 police, I want you to know. But it was really concentrated. That's where you saw the scenes and the protests. So she points out when George Floyd died, there was a memorial, a makeshift memorial to where he was killed. And later, a more formal place, they established the George Floyd Square, which was a memorial. And from that point, from 2020, that George Floyd memorial space became a gathering point. It never stopped. It continued to become a gathering point for people to assemble to talk about healing and trauma and organizing. It never stopped. And so that map starts at the site where George Floyd is assassinated, and it becomes a space to come together in the city to reinforce ideas about community, about anti-state police violence, and a network is built that is mapped across the area. So that's what the mapping is. The other important point to note is it is less than a mile, the George Floyd Memorial Square, from where Renee Good was assassinated. When I tell you that it was this community where Renee Good was assassinated and where she lived, presumably they would have lived in the same community. So that's important to note, this mapping and this power mapping. The map of blocks between where George Floyd died to where he was killed to where Renee Good was killed, and knowing that she was in proximity, very close proximity to her house. So this space was activated. These were not, this community and the institutions that they were tied to, the schools and the churches and the community centers and the organizations and the immigrant rights organizations, they were tied through the tragedy and the networking that came out of the George Floyd Square. Okay. Now the people who showed up because they saw the resistance were tied to that. But the beginning of this movement that we see in 2026, 2025, has roots within the work and the organizing of Black women in 2020. Despite how general shots that we've all seen, sees protesters who are largely white. We know why other people of color are out there, because they are targets, right? But I want to put this in context. So let's talk about the power part. We talked about the mapping part, the significance of where this is all happening, and the roots of that happening and organizing from 2020. Let's talk about the power and what Tish Jones in this town hall says as the groundwork was laid at that time. The groundwork was laid. So the idea, and she says, the resistance that we've seen for the last month is not new. It is ongoing resistance and work from the power of what she calls underground communications channels. Underground communications channels. I have a friend who lives there, and I lived vicariously and cried vicariously through her. We were at the same institution at one time, and she became a professor at the University of Minnesota. And we all have kids the same age because we were all together here where I live now and where she used to live. And she would say, there's a mom's group, there's a signal chat, I'm doing my part, you sign up. She was signing up for, shout out to Melissa, she was signed up to patrol the area around the schools and escort students into the buildings. And yeah, check on your friends in Minneapolis, because they're tired and they're exhausted and they're depleted. But the groundwork was laid for the resistance that we've witnessed in the 8 months through the work of Black women activists after George Floyd. So, like I said with my friend, there were signal accounts, there were underground communication channels. Jones talks about the groundwork in terms of training, education, liberation education, nonviolent disobedience training, know your rights training. All of these things were happening and were working towards this moment in late 2025 and 2026. And she talks about these women building networks across Minneapolis and beyond, networks that were intentionally multicultural coalitions, right? And that's all the key here. And that's why you see who you see. And that's why it was activated so long. It wasn't just a network of Black Lives Matter activists. It were their intentional work of building networks with their own secret communication channels and sponsoring trainings that can help educate and put this context in this struggle among multicultural organizations and coalitions across the area. That is the work of Black women that is not always visible, but it's essential. That's why Minneapolis. And it's not the discount. There is work. There are definite loud, outspoken activist communities in LA, Chicago, and DC, and in New Orleans, because remember they deployed to New Orleans as well. It's not to downplay the work of folks there, but my point is, what I gathered from the town hall is that these networks were built and extended in 2020, which made it. They were activated from high profile murders of not only George Floyd, but there's a whole list of others, and you can see my the thumbnail, a series of state killings, and that network grew. The seeds of that network grew to make the resistance movement so strong, so multicultural, building mutual aid networks that began with Black women in the aftermath of George Floyd. So that's what I got out of the town hall. Looking at my notes. From a Black feminist geography perspective is a term called abolitionist geographies. And abolitionist geographies is popularized by, guess what? A geographer, Black woman by the name of Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And what was sparked and characterized in that town hall and this idea of power mapping and Black women activists, my geography brain said, this is abolitionist geographies. This is what Ruth Wilson Gilmore is talking about. This is what it looks like in practice. Yes. So what is abolitionist geographies? To put it in its simplest form, it's recognizing and seeing and connecting carceral spaces. Carceral spaces are detention centers, most notably prisons, internment camps, concentration camps, chattel slavery, the plantation, right? Recognizing and seeing carceral spaces where people are dominated because of a certain status and housed, recognizes that space, and then it develops, after recognition, it develops a map or a pathway for liberation and freedom in the form of being in that place or fleeing to another place. Okay, abolitionist geographies is recognizing carceral spaces. In this case, the carceral space was literally Minneapolis, while simultaneously not saying as victims, oh, woe is us, ICE is here. But the action part of it is creating and developing a way to free that space, to liberate those people who are constrained. That's the important part, the action part. And what Tish Jones was talking about in terms of power mapping and creating communications channels that were underground and training and networking and building multi-coalitions was a form of abolitionist geographies. And it's important that this was abolitionist geographies were started and cultivated by Black women and other women of color. And those seeds that were sown in 2020 and continue to be cultivated, culminated in the resistance that we saw against ICE. That's it. Let me tell you a little bit more about abolitionist geographies and how I connect that with the work that I do. So again, it's Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She started out, her analysis about abolitionist geographies really began with prisons, specifically California's prison system. She wrote a book years ago called The Golden Gulag, where she was able to describe the entire statewide system, not just the prisons, but the proxies for prisons, and how they disproportionately house Black bodies, and created a pathway to talk about what she saw as abolishing prisons. And so we hear abolition. We've heard it more recently when there was a whole thing about abolish ICE. 2018, this is before George Floyd, about abolish ICE. That was a movement that was similar to an abolitionist geographies. And that was defund the police, right? So this idea of abolition in place has been around and is pretty popularized by those things of abolish ICE in 2017 and defund the police from 2020. And what that means is just what they say. They didn't say reform ICE. They didn't say reform ICE. Now, Congress right now is talking about reforming ICE, and this budget freeze on DHS funding is to tinker at the edges of ICE. No face mask, written warrants, identification. And some of us who have been around longer remember Abolish ICE. And the idea here, and defund the police, the idea here, calling up abolition, is that these systems cannot be reformed, that the basis of these systems is akin to slave patrollers and a system of hierarchy, of racial hierarchy and white supremacy and Black pathology and brown pathology. And if they are built in that system, you can't tinker at the edges, because the ideologies behind the creation and the sustenance of those systems are inherently racist, patriarchal, and unjust. So that's important to remember too. Abolish ICE is back in our lexicon as much as it was before. And remember, people were like, you can't abolish ICE, or, you can't defund the police. But from an abolitionist geography point of view, that in order for us to live safely and for us not to live in fear is to abolish these systems and create something that is more just, because you can't reform them. An example that I use for people who aren't willing to say, I don't want to go so far as to abolish ICE. I don't want to go so far as to defund the police. And remember, defund the police was more about allocation of funds to social services, mental health services. And we need to put more money into helping people versus targeting people. So for those of you who can't get on board with that, and that's okay. But here's what I want you to think about. Here's what I want you to think about. What if the abolitionists back in the 1800s said, let's reform slavery? Slavery is bad, but let's reform it. Let's tinker at the edges of slavery. How do you feel about that? How could we tinker? Or maybe we could create policy that, the slaves could get more food or more shoes, or let's tinker. Let's not change it. Slavery is okay. We're just gonna tinker at the edges of it. Are you going to remove the fact that people don't receive wages and people's bodies are literally owned from cradle to grave? We're just going to tinker at the edges. Maybe you have to get a license to get slaves. You see how that doesn't work, right? You see how you cannot reform chattel slavery. The very ideological foundations of slavery is white supremacy, right? Like if you tinker at the edges, that supremacy stays right there, right? So you can't tinker at the edges of immigration enforcement, and you can't tinker at the edges of police if the roots and the foundations upon which these institutions are built are unjust and are targeting people and removing people and disappearing people. We'll talk about disappearing in another video. I have some thoughts about that word being used. So I want people, the takeaway from all of this is to give Black women their due. Black women activists have been working in abolitionist geographies. Also, we could talk about insurgent geographies for a very long time, as long as Tubman. Like, let's go further than that in the diaspora. As long as Queen Nanny in the Jamaican Maroons, okay? As long as the mutiny on the transatlantic slave ships. We have been working at abolishing these systems. Harriet Tubman, because my favorite subject is Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman would not have gone for a tinkering of the system of slavery, that it required a complete destruction and dismantlement of that institution. and that Black women are always thinking and organizing in ways of liberation. And we can see that the products of that liberation in Minneapolis. What you think? You like my ideas? Am I crazy? Comment below. Let me know what you think. Do you understand how you cannot tinker with something that's on the foundations? Let me know. I would love to hear your but put your butts. But what will happen if we don't have police? Then there can be a system that is more equitable, right? And there are scholars who are working on kind of community-based policing that doesn't require the type of policing that we have today. It requires imagination. It requires the idea of possibilities. But yeah, I want feedback. What do you think about what I said, and how this brings me to kind of SoulJourners Academy? As I said before, the work that I do and I try to do and get in community with others who want to learn about this, ideas of insurgent and abolitionist geographies, and the way that I put together, I curate workshops and tours that highlight these types of geographies. When you go someplace that's very popular, we'll go to that beach. That's fine. But I want to show you the site of Black resistance. I think that that's important to know. I think that's why this administration is trying to get rid of any memorial to Black resistance, Philadelphia, right? Because these sites of Black resistance demonstrate that it can be done, that there are strategies and places where Black people found a way to free themselves, short of an abolition of slavery, right? That there are stories about Black people freeing themselves. And I don't believe, some do, that Black people across the world, African descended people are united by struggle. I don't like that. I like to think about Black people are united, African descended people are united by the ability to resist, to find possibilities in our liberation and freedom and find it for others. We believe in multicultural coalitions. I want to believe that Black descended people are connected through the resilience and the liberation movements part. And that's what is one of the priorities and why I take families to different places. It's why I take families to the Caribbean part of Costa Rica, why I take families to maroon settlements in Jamaica. It's why I will take families to the Black descended areas in Mexico in the future and in Puerto Rico. That's why I think that's important. I think that story needs to be told alongside the struggle. And we can see how abolitionist geographies are being dismantled in terms of memorials all over. Because if they know that, then we know that people have imagined a pathway to freedom and that there is a possibility to do it under state surveillance and the threat of state violence. So if you're interested in that, if you're interested in my offerings, I invite you to go to my website, follow SoulJourners Academy on Facebook, and I'll put all that in the description. So I hope I gave you something to think about, and I hope I, sparked your interest. And again, if you haven't done it already, please like and subscribe and share, and let's keep this conversation going. Let me know what you think in the comments about this idea of abolition geographies. And if you have another idea, I think mine's pretty good though. And I'll see you next time. Take care.